In the hush of the Wisconsin dusk, when the world felt as though it had been wrapped up in the thin fabric of the last light, the two brothers stood in the shadow of their family's cottage. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the scent of pine needles, wet moss, and something metallic, a scent that didn't quite fit. The cottage sat alone in the woods, a quiet place with paint that had faded into the colors of the forest. Behind it, a winding river moved in silent curves, glistening with the last slivers of evening light. Above the trees, the sky held a fading violet that pressed down on everything with a kind of silent weight. Jake, the older one by 16 long years, stood there with his hands in his pockets, chewing on the edge of his lip like it might keep him warm. He was 34, with lines around his eyes that made him look older, especially to Will, who still had his awkward teenage face and the strange wisdom of someone who could see things others didn't. Jake didn't want to be here. Not really. He came only because his mother asked. But Will's letters, the ones their mother found and didn't read, told stories of sightings, of visions, of things in the woods that no one else could see. They didn't talk much, these two. The years between them were full of other things. Jake's lost weekends, missed birthdays, unanswered phone calls. But out here, with just the river for company, words felt small and insignificant. Instead, they stood together in the silence, as they did whenever Jake came to visit, both waiting for something they couldn't quite name. It was Will who noticed it first, a subtle shift in the air, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. He looked up, squinting through the tall pines, and there it was, a black triangle, sharp-edged and perfect, moving slowly as if it were drifting rather than flying. It seemed to absorb the light around it, casting no shadow, making no sound. Just a silent, gliding presence, close enough that they could make out its texture, almost like stone. It hung there above them, silent and enormous, feeling less like a machine and more like some ancient thing that had only now chosen to make itself known. Jake sucked in a breath, his fists clenching, though he wasn't sure if it was out of fear or awe. He could feel Will's eyes on him, wide and unblinking. And for the first time in years, he felt the kind of quiet terror that came when something breaks the rules of the world. They had seen strange things together before, lights in the sky, shadows darting between trees. But this was different. This felt deliberate, like it was watching them back. "What do you think it wants?" Will's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Jake didn't answer, but he took a step closer to his brother, his hand brushing against Will's shoulder. They stood there, two silhouettes beneath the weight of a silent machine, feeling small and unimportant in the shadow of something that didn't belong in the world they knew. The triangle hovered for another moment, as if savoring the silence. Then slowly, it began to move again, drifting over the treetops and down the line of the river, disappearing into the night as quietly as it had come. They watched it go, the silence around them thickening, growing heavier with each second. And when it was gone, they were left standing there, two brothers bound together by a thing they couldn't name, wondering if anyone would believe them, or if even they believed it themselves. For a long time after the triangle disappeared, Jake and Will just stood there, feeling the strangeness settle around them. The forest seemed darker now, as though the night itself had thickened, drawing close to listen. Jake's heart was still hammering in his chest. He'd seen strange things before, but nothing like this. He glanced sideways at Will, who was staring up at the sky. His expression caught somewhere between wonder and dread. That face, Will's young, awkward, angular face, reminded Jake of something, but he couldn't quite put a name to it. "You all right?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. Will nodded slowly, eyes still on the stars, as if searching for something else out there. "Yeah," he whispered. Then he turned to Jake, the ghost of a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Think they'll come back?" Jake wanted to laugh it off, shrug it away, tell Will not to get his hopes up. But he couldn't. That triangle, that silent black thing that had hovered above them like a dream, felt too real, too close, like it had left something behind in the air. "Maybe," he said, though it sounded weak to his own ears. They walked back to the cottage together, not saying much. But Jake felt Will's eyes on him, and there was something there that reminded him of when Will was a kid. A curiosity, an expectation, something fragile and bright. Jake didn't want to be the one to break it, not tonight. Inside, the cottage felt colder than usual. They moved about in silence, Jake filling the kettle with water, setting it on the stove, and Will lingering by the window, staring out at the woods as if he might see that triangle again. The place was rustic, with creaky floors, mismatched furniture, and an old green sofa that sagged in the middle. The walls were lined with dusty trinkets, faded books, and odd, forgotten items, relics of family weekends and summer vacations from years gone by. Will turned to him, his voice almost timid. "Do you think Dad ever saw anything like that out here?" Jake paused, surprised by the question. Their father, always the pragmatic one, had dismissed Will's fascination with UFOs as nonsense, and was never one to indulge in talk of strange lights or unidentified objects. But sometimes, on nights like this, Jake wondered. There had been stories their dad never told, secrets tucked into the quiet of those deep Wisconsin woods. "He'd probably tell us we were imagining things," Jake muttered, though a part of him wasn't so sure. He stirred a spoon through his cup of coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. But he had to see something, Will pressed, moving closer to Jake, as if afraid his brother might walk away. "I mean, why would he come out here so much? By himself?" Jake shrugged. It was easier not to wonder too deeply about his father's late-night trips to the cottage. Guess he just liked it out here. Will fell silent, his fingers drumming against the countertop. You don't remember that time when I was little and we came out here in winter? When Dad said we should go inside early? Jake frowned, sifting through old memories that felt foggy and strange. He did remember that winter, the one where the snow had piled up so high they could barely drive up the long gravel road. Their dad had seemed nervous, constantly looking out the window, and they'd stayed inside most of the weekend, listening to the wind howl through the trees. But that memory, like so many others out here, felt hazy, as if it didn't belong entirely to him. Maybe, Jake said, though he couldn't be sure. But that doesn't mean anything. Will was staring at him now, his eyes wide, his hands knotted together. Do you think he knew about them? Jake opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. The air felt charged, almost like the cabin itself was listening, waiting for something to be said. He remembered the sound of his father's voice, firm and steady, warning them about stories, about how people out in the country tended to make things up to pass the time. Imagination can run away from you if you're not careful, he used to say. But that memory felt like a lie now, as thin as the frost on the river out back. I don't know, Will, Jake admitted, his voice softer than he'd intended. He saw the glimmer of disappointment in Will's eyes, and something stirred in him, something that felt like regret or maybe fear. What if he was hiding something? Will whispered. What if he knew things we aren't supposed to know? Jake didn't answer, but he felt the weight of those words settle between them like a shadow. A loud, unexpected thunk rattled the side of the cottage. Both of them froze, and for a moment, neither spoke. The night was silent again, but the kind of silence that felt too thick, too heavy, as though something was crouched just outside the walls, listening. Will's eyes met Jake's, wide with something that looked like panic. They were both thinking the same thing. Had the triangle come back, or was something else out there, lurking in the dark? Jake moved to the door slowly, his footsteps silent, his hand reaching for the rusted knob. Will held his breath, following close behind. The door creaked open, and they both peered out into the night. The moon had risen high, casting a dim, silver light over the trees, the river, and the field that stretched out behind the cottage. Nothing moved, but the forest felt alive, pulsing with an energy they couldn't see. There was another thunk, louder this time, echoing from somewhere deep within the woods, like the beat of a heart. Then, in the moonlight, they saw it. A shape, tall and dark, standing at the edge of the trees. It didn't look like a person. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its face hidden in shadow. And though it made no sound, they could feel it watching them, its eyes like two cold embers glinting in the dark. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was like the thing had reached into his mind, gripping him in a way he couldn't explain. Will was trembling beside him, his breath quick and shallow. Jake, what is that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at the shape in the trees, feeling it reach into him, seeing it in flashes that didn't make sense. The triangle, his father's voice, the winters they'd spent out here, and that thing, that silent watcher standing there as if it had been waiting for them all along. "Get inside," Jake muttered, his voice hoarse. He grabbed Will's arm, pulling him back, slamming the door behind them. His hands were shaking, his mind spinning. They stood there in the middle of the room, the cottage walls closing in around them. But Jake knew that walls couldn't keep them safe. Not from this. He knew that whatever was out there, whatever had come for them, was already inside, lurking in the silence, threading itself through their memories, waiting for them to see it. And in the back of his mind, he heard his father's voice again, this time as a whisper, slipping out from some dark corner of his memory. "Be careful what you look for, Jake. Some things are better left unseen." He looked at Will, and for the first time, he wondered if coming here had been a mistake. If the triangle and the watcher in the woods were only the beginning of something darker, something that had been waiting for them all along. The night pressed on, cold and unnerving, with an almost sentient silence. Jake and Will sat in the cottage, not daring to look at each other, not saying anything. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the wall, marking seconds that felt more like hours. Jake's mind spun with memories, fragments of things he had forgotten, or maybe tried to forget. His father's warnings, the strange quiet that had always seemed to descend around the cottage, the subtle tension in his father's eyes whenever they came out here as kids. The silence felt like it held answers, but Jake was afraid to reach into it, afraid of what he might find. Will broke the quiet first, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Jake, do you think it's still out there?" Jake swallowed, his throat dry. He couldn't shake the feeling of that figure, that tall, silent shape watching them from the woods, its eyes boring into them with a knowledge that felt ancient. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough, "but I think we should stay inside tonight." Will nodded, his eyes darting to the windows, to the shadows that flickered just beyond the glass. I think it was here before we got here, Jake, like it was waiting." The words hit Jake hard. He'd felt it, too, that strange, almost preordained feeling, like they'd walked right into something meant for them. The air in the cottage felt heavy, laced with some unknown presence, something that had come up from the roots of the forest itself. As the minutes dragged on, Jake tried to distract himself, but the quiet of the cottage was like an itch he couldn't scratch. He found himself pacing, moving from room to room, checking the windows and the locks, feeling like something was pressing in on them from all sides. Will stayed on the sofa, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his face pale and thoughtful. Finally, Jake stepped in front of an old bookshelf, dusty and neglected, filled with books that belonged to their father. He remembered these books, the ones their dad would pack every time they came out here, the ones he never let the boys touch. He pulled one off the shelf, blowing the dust off the cover. It was an old, battered journal, its pages yellowed and worn. Jake flipped it open, his eyes scanning the cramped handwriting, each word dense and inked with the kind of precision that their father had always had. "What's that?" Will's voice was a tremor in the quiet. Jake didn't answer right away. The words on the page didn't make sense at first. Cryptic entries, strange sketches of shapes that looked like the triangle they had seen in the sky, and diagrams of tall figures that looked unsettlingly familiar. It's Dad's, Jake said finally, his voice barely audible. He must have kept it here. Will moved closer, peering over Jake's shoulder. The pages were filled with diagrams and lists, each one stranger than the last. Coordinates, measurements, notes about the phases of the moon. There were entries about sightings, lights in the sky, descriptions of strange beings that their father had seen in the woods at night. He wrote about a presence in the forest, something he couldn't see but felt around him like static. "Look at this," Will murmured, pointing to a section near the back of the journal. The handwriting was messier here, almost frantic, as if their father had been in a hurry. The words were hard to read, but Jake made out a few lines. "The woods are alive tonight. Shadows beyond the river. They watch. They wait. It's coming closer each time. I don't know how long I can keep them away." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you think he meant by that?" Will looked up at him, his face pale. Maybe he knew about that thing we saw. Maybe he was trying to protect us from it." The thought lingered heavy and unsettling. Had their father known about whatever was out there, watching from the shadows? Had he kept it a secret all these years, carrying the weight of it alone? They turned another page, and Jake's breath caught. There was a rough sketch of the triangular craft they'd seen in the sky, drawn in meticulous detail. Below it, their father had scrawled a single line: "The Sentinel has returned." "The Sentinel," Will whispered, his voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Jake didn't know, but the word carried a strange weight. He could almost feel it resonating through the walls of the cottage, echoing in the spaces between each creak and groan of the old wooden beams. They both froze as a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. It was a deep, resonant sound, like a distant engine, growing louder by the second. The windows rattled, the dishes on the shelves trembled, and for a moment it felt like the entire cottage might shake apart. Jake's heart pounded as he moved to the window, pressing his face to the glass. Outside, above the trees, he saw it again. The black triangle, drifting slowly, its edges glinting faintly in the moonlight. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were other shapes moving in the sky, smaller and faster, darting in and out of the shadows. They surrounded the triangle, spiraling around it in a strange, silent dance. The forest was bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow, casting long shadows over the cottage and the winding river. Will came up beside him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror and fascination. "Jake, what is happening?" Jake didn't have an answer. He watched as the triangle hovered, almost directly above the cottage now, its silent entourage of smaller crafts circling it like planets around a dark sun. They seemed to pulse with a faint, flickering light, each one casting an ethereal glow that shimmered through the trees, painting the forest in shades of blue and silver. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the crafts froze in place, hanging in the air like stars suspended in water. For a moment, everything was still, and Jake could feel the silence pressing down on him, suffocating as though the entire world had been wrapped up in that soundless moment. The triangle began to descend, drifting lower, its massive form blotting out the sky above them. Jake could feel the vibration in his chest, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to echo through his bones. And then, just as it neared the treetops, it stopped, hovering in place as if waiting for something. A beam of light shot down from its center, illuminating a spot just beyond the edge of the river. The light was blinding, piercing through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. Without thinking, Jake grabbed Will's arm. "Stay here." Will looked at him, fear etched across his face. "You're not going out there, are you?" Jake nodded, his mouth dry. I have to. I don't know why, but I feel like I have to." Before Will could protest, Jake slipped out the door, moving toward the river, his footsteps soft on the forest floor. The beam of light beckoned him, pulling him forward like a moth to a flame. He could hear Will calling his name, but it sounded distant, muffled as if coming from the other side of a wall. As he stepped into the light, the hum grew louder, vibrating through his body. He felt weightless, like he was floating, caught between the earth and the sky. And in that moment, he knew with a certainty that defied explanation, that whatever was waiting for him in that light had been waiting for him all his life. He looked up, his eyes meeting the dark void at the center of the triangle, and felt something reach into his mind, probing, searching. Memories flashed before him, scenes from his childhood, from nights spent at this cottage, moments he had forgotten, or tried to forget. And then a voice, soft and low, filled his mind, a voice that was neither kind nor cruel, but something in between. "You have been chosen, Jake." He felt a surge of panic, but the light held him in place, trapping him in that moment. He could feel Will watching from the edge of the forest, his presence like a distant pulse, a reminder of something real, something human. The voice echoed in his mind again. "The Sentinel has returned, and with it, the time of reckoning." The light flickered, pulsing, and in that flicker, Jake caught a glimpse of something, a vision of a world not his own, of landscapes bathed in unfamiliar starlight, of cities built in shapes that defied logic. He saw shadows moving through those cities, figures tall and silent, their eyes like embers watching him from across the vastness of space. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light faded, the hum died away, and Jake found himself standing alone on the edge of the river, the night around him cold and dark once more. He turned, his legs weak, and saw Will standing at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and awe. What did you see?" Will asked, his voice a tremor in the quiet. Jake didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the Sentinel had returned, and that whatever it meant, whatever it had shown him, their lives would never be the same again.